In the cold, damp heart of the 12th century, a woman of unparalleled power stood amidst the stone corridors of Westminster. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not merely a queen, she was a sovereign in her own right, holding the vast lands of southern France. Having already discarded the crown of France, she now wore the heavy gold of England, married to the formidable Henry II. But the weight of the crown was nothing compared to the growing shadows within her own house. As she looked upon her expanding empire, the first whispers of a tragedy that would span decades began to echo through the silent, torch-lit halls. Henry II was a man of restless energy and explosive temper, a king who transformed the legal landscape of England while building an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Together, he and Eleanor were the most powerful couple in Christendom, their union a calculated merger of land, title, and ambition. In these early years, their partnership seemed invincible, a forge in which the future of Britain was being hammered out. Yet beneath the surface of their shared governance, a subtle struggle for dominance was taking shape, as Henry's desire for total control began to stifle Eleanor's own political agency. The dynasty's strength was solidified through the birth of their sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. To the world, these boys represented the glorious future of the House of Plantagenet. Eleanor poured her hopes into them, cultivating their education and their sense of royal entitlement in the courts of Poitiers and London. She saw in them the extension of her own legacy, a way to ensure that the blood of Aquitaine would forever rule the north. However, the very ambition she nurtured in her children would soon become the weapon that would tear the family apart from within. As the boys grew into men, the friction between father and sons became a palpable force at court. Henry II was a king who refused to share the substance of power, even as he granted the titles. He crowned his eldest son, Henry, as co-king, yet denied him any actual revenue or land to govern. This hollow gesture served only to ignite a burning resentment in the young man's heart. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, her own influence being systematically curtailed by her husband, as she realized that her sons were being treated as mere pawns in Henry's grand design. The court of Henry II was a place of constant movement and intellectual rigor, but it was also a breeding ground for jealousy and suspicion. Courtiers whispered in the dark corners of the Great Hall, sensing the growing rift between the king and his queen. Eleanor began to spend more time in her ancestral lands of Aquitaine, creating a court of her own that celebrated the arts and the codes of chivalry. Here, away from Henry's watchful eye, she began to forge a dangerous bond with her sons, one that was built on shared grievances against the man who ruled them all. The tension reached a breaking point when Henry II's volatile relationship with the church ended in the shocking murder of Thomas Becket. The scandal rocked the foundations of the monarchy and left Henry politically vulnerable. For Eleanor, this was a moment of realization. She saw her husband's authority waver and recognized that the time for quiet endurance had passed. The king's obsession with his mistresses, particularly the fair Rosamond Clifford, further alienated Eleanor, turning her cold heart toward a path of active resistance. The unity of the Plantagenet household was now a fragile facade, ready to shatter. In the year 1173, the spark of rebellion finally caught fire. The young King Henry, tired of his father's empty promises, fled to the French court of Louis VII, his mother's first husband. He was soon joined by his brothers Richard and Geoffrey. This was not a mere tantrum of youth. It was a coordinated strike against the crown of England. Eleanor was the architect of this exodus, providing her sons with the resources and the encouragement to challenge their father's hegemony. She chose her children over her husband, effectively declaring war on the man she had once helped build an empire. Henry II was blindsided by the scale of the betrayal. He had faced rebellions before, but never one led by his own flesh and blood, and orchestrated by the woman who knew his every secret. The Great Revolt, as it came to be known, pulled the Angevin Empire into a state of civil war. From the castles of Normandy to the hills of England, the family was divided. Henry found himself fighting on multiple fronts, his brilliance as a strategist tested by the very sons he had raised to be warriors. The bonds of blood were being rewritten in the language of steel and siege. While her sons led armies in the field, Eleanor attempted to join them in France, seeking to lead the rebellion from the front. She disguised herself as a man to cross the dangerous borderlands, a testament to her desperation and her resolve. But the king's scouts were everywhere. In a moment that would change the course of her life, she was intercepted and captured by Henry's loyalists. The Queen of England was now a prisoner of her husband. Her attempt to overthrow the patriarch had failed, but the fire she had lit in her sons continued to burn with an uncontrollable intensity. Eleanor was brought before Henry, not as a partner, but as a traitor. The king, unable to bring himself to execute the mother of his children, chose a different kind of death, the death of her freedom. He ordered her to be imprisoned in various castles across England, far from the centers of power and the influence of her sons. For the next 16 years, the woman who had ruled empires would watch from behind stone walls as her family continued to tear itself apart. The collapse she had helped initiate was now beyond her control, a tragedy she was forced to witness in silence. Eleanor's confinement began in the cold, wind-swept heights of Old Sarum. The fortress was a cage of high stone and low sky, where the former Queen of France and England was reduced to a mere spectator of her own life. She spent her days pacing narrow, damp corridors, her only connection to the outside world being the guarded reports of her husband's movements and her son's growing discontent. The luxury of the court was replaced by the austerity of a political prison, and the vibrant life of Poitou became a distant memory. As the years turned into a slow, grinding cycle, the silence of her prison became her only companion, echoing the hollowness of her shattered family. Outside her walls, King Henry II was a man besieged by his own blood. His sons, spurred by Eleanor's earlier defiance and their own thirst for power, continued to launch sporadic rebellions across the Angevin Empire. Henry, once the most powerful man in Europe, found himself constantly on the move, suppressing fires of dissent lit by the boys he had raised to be his heirs. The king's face aged rapidly, etched with the lines of betrayal. He was a lion surrounded by wolves, and the worst part was that the wolves shared his name. The crown he had worked so hard to secure was becoming a heavy burden of sorrow. Henry the young king, the eldest surviving son, felt the sting of being a king in name only. He wore a crown but possessed no real land or revenue. His frustration boiled over into a second major rebellion in 1183. He turned to the French king for support, further deepening the rift within the Plantagenet dynasty. Eleanor, hearing whispers of the conflict from her guards, could only imagine the chaos her son was sowing. The family was now a house divided against itself, with brothers taking sides and a father forced to wage war against his firstborn. The collapse she had feared was no longer a threat. It was a reality. Tragedy struck in the heat of the rebellion. Henry the young king fell ill with dysentery while campaigning against his father. As death approached, the young man was filled with remorse, begging for his father's forgiveness and for the release of his mother. He died on a bed of ashes, wearing a hair shirt as a sign of penance, a king who had never truly ruled. When news reached Henry II, the king was devastated, his anger replaced by a crushing grief. The first of Eleanor's sons was gone, and the family's foundation began to crumble in earnest, leaving a void that would never be filled. In her prison, Eleanor received the news of her son's death with a stony silence that masked a deep, internal agony. The boy she had once held as the future of her line was dead in rebellion against his father. She was denied the right to mourn him at his funeral, her grief confined within the same four walls that had held her for years. The news served as a grim reminder of the cost of her ambitions. The children she had used as pieces in a grand political game were now suffering the consequences, and she was powerless to reach them or offer comfort. The cycle of loss did not end with the young king. In 1186, Eleanor's third son, Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, died during a tournament in Paris. Known for his cunning and political maneuvering, Geoffrey's death removed another piece from the board. For Henry II, it was another blow to his legacy. For Eleanor, it was the loss of another child, while she remained a captive. The brothers who remained, Richard and John, were now the primary rivals for their father's waning favor. The tension between them grew, fueled by their father's refusal to name a clear successor, ensuring the family's collapse would continue unabated. Richard, now the heir apparent, grew increasingly paranoid of his father's intentions. He feared that Henry favored the youngest son, John, and intended to bypass Richard for the crown. This paranoia drove Richard into an alliance with the new French king, Philip Augustus. The two men, once friends and now political allies, prepared to take by force what Henry would not give freely. Eleanor, watching from her distant prison, saw the patterns repeating. Another son was turning to the French crown to topple his father, a cycle of betrayal that she herself had helped initiate decades ago. By 1189, Henry II was a broken man. Suffering from a painful ulcer and exhaustion, he was pursued across his French territories by Richard and Philip. His health was failing, and his spirit was even more fragile. He sought refuge in his birthplace of Le Mans, only to see the city set ablaze to prevent its capture. The king was forced to flee through the smoke and flames, a hollowed-out version of the monarch he once was. He was losing his lands, his health, and most importantly, the loyalty of those he had once trusted most. The end of his reign was approaching in fire and shame. The final betrayal was the one that truly killed Henry II. While negotiating a humiliating peace treaty with Richard and Philip, he asked for a list of those who had joined the rebellion against him. At the top of the list was the name of his youngest and favorite son, John. The realization that even John had turned against him broke the king's heart. He whispered, "Now let things go as they will. I care no more for myself or for the world." He retreated to the castle of Chinon, where he succumbed to his illness, dying alone and embittered by his family's treachery. With the death of Henry II, the gates of Eleanor's prison finally swung open. After 16 years of captivity, she was freed by the order of her son, the new King Richard I. She emerged from the shadows of her confinement not as a broken old woman, but as a queen restored to her full power. At 67 years old, she took charge of the kingdom while Richard prepared for the Crusades. The family she had watched collapse was now hers to manage once more, but the scars of the last 2 decades remained, a permanent mark on the history of England and the woman who survived it all. In September 1189, the bells of Westminster Abbey rang out, not for the man who had imprisoned Eleanor, but for the son she had championed. Richard the Lionheart was crowned King of England in a display of unprecedented grandeur. Eleanor, standing at the center of the court, was no longer a captive, but the true architect of the Plantagenet legacy. She had survived a husband who sought to break her, and now she watched her favorite son take the mantle of power. Yet even amidst the incense and gold, the weight of the crown was heavy. The kingdom was a fragile vessel in the hands of a warrior king who looked toward the east rather than his own shores. Richard's ambition was not for the governance of England, but for the glory of the Third Crusade. Within months of his coronation, he drained the royal treasury and prepared to depart for the Holy Land, leaving the realm in the hands of his mother. Eleanor, now nearly 70, found herself the de facto ruler of a nation she had once been forbidden to see. As she watched the sails of Richard's fleet vanish into the horizon, the silence of the English court felt like a prelude to another storm. She was the anchor for a family that was constantly drifting toward chaos, holding the keys to the kingdom while her sons chased shadows across distant sands. With Richard gone, the internal threats to the crown intensified. Prince John, the youngest and most volatile of Eleanor's sons, remained in England, his eyes fixed on the throne his brother had vacated. Eleanor knew the history of her family too well. She saw the same seeds of rebellion in John that had once consumed his father and older brothers. To secure Richard's lineage and stabilize the succession, Eleanor took it upon herself to find him a queen. She looked toward Navarre, selecting the Princess Berengaria, a move of calculated diplomacy intended to weave a new web of alliances that would protect the Plantagenet interests while the king was at war. Despite her advanced age, Eleanor embarked on a grueling journey across the Pyrenees to fetch Berengaria and bring her to Richard. This was not the act of a grandmother seeking rest, but of a queen who understood that the survival of her house depended on her presence. She traveled through harsh winters and dangerous territories, her carriage a moving fortress of diplomacy. Each mile was a testament to her iron will. She was racing against time and the ambitions of the French king, Philip II, who sought to undermine Richard's reign. In this high-stakes game of marriages and borders, Eleanor was the ultimate player, navigating the treacherous terrain of medieval Europe. Eleanor finally reached Richard in Sicily, delivering his bride before returning to a kingdom that was rapidly fracturing. In her absence, Prince John had begun to openly challenge the authority of Richard's chancellors. He cultivated the loyalty of disgruntled barons, whispering of a king who would never return from the desert. Eleanor arrived back in England to find a house divided once again. The tragedy of her life, watching her children turn against one another, was repeating itself in the damp halls of Windsor and London. She was the only force capable of restraining John's ego, a mother forced to police the treachery of her own blood for the sake of the crown. Disaster struck in 1192. As Richard attempted to return from the Crusades in disguise, he was captured by Leopold of Austria and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. The news shattered the fragile peace Eleanor had maintained. The King of England was a prisoner in a foreign land, and the ransom demanded was a sum so vast it threatened to bankrupt the nation. John saw this as his moment to seize the throne, entering into a dark alliance with King Philip of France. Eleanor, now faced with the loss of her favorite son and the betrayal of her youngest, stood as the sole defender of Richard's rights. Eleanor's response to Richard's capture was a masterclass in administrative fury and maternal devotion. She imposed the Saladin tithe, a crushing tax on every citizen, and ordered the melting down of church silver and gold. No corner of the kingdom was exempt from the burden of the king's ransom. She personally oversaw the collection, her presence at the exchequer ensuring that not a single coin was diverted by John's agents. The weight of the gold was the weight of Richard's life, and Eleanor carried it with a grim determination. She was stripping the land to save its king, a sacrifice that further strained the family's relationship with the people. During the months of negotiation, Eleanor's pen became as sharp as any sword. She wrote a series of scathing letters to Pope Celestine III, demanding his intervention and accusing the papacy of cowardice for failing to protect a crusading king. She signed herself Eleanor by the wrath of God, Queen of England, a title that reflected her bitterness and her power. These letters, preserved in history, reveal a woman who refused to be silenced by the conventions of her time or the limits of her gender. She was fighting a spiritual and political war on all fronts, holding the emperor at bay while keeping John's hands off the crown. In 1194, at the age of 71, Eleanor personally traveled to Germany to deliver the ransom and secure Richard's release. She faced the Holy Roman Emperor not as a supplicant, but as an equal, her reputation preceding her across the continent. The image of the aged Queen Mother traveling through the heart of Europe to buy back her son's freedom became legendary. When she finally saw Richard emerge from his confinement, the reunion was not merely a family triumph, but a geopolitical victory. She had outmaneuvered emperors, popes, and her own rebellious son, proving that the heart of the Plantagenet Empire beat within her own chest. Upon their return to England, the reckoning with John was swift. Richard was inclined to punish his brother with fire and blood, but Eleanor intervened. She understood that further internal war would only finish what the previous 2 decades had started: the total collapse of their house. She forced a reconciliation, compelling John to beg for Richard's mercy. In a scene of forced humility, John knelt before the brother he had tried to replace, while Eleanor watched from the shadows. She had stitched the family back together, but the seams were frayed and the trust was gone. The Queen had saved her son, but the legacy of the family remained a fractured glass. Richard's eyes were fixed on the horizon, his mind consumed by the recovery of his continental lands. Philip II of France was no longer a brother in arms, but a predator circling the Angevin borders. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, saw the strain this eternal conflict placed on their coffers. She watched as her son poured the wealth of England into the stone and mortar of Chateau Gaillard. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, yet to her it looked like a monument to vanity built upon shifting sands. The peace she had brokered was merely a prelude to a more desperate war. The construction of the saucy castle was a marvel that defied the French king, yet the cost was more than coin. Eleanor walked the ramparts, feeling the cold wind of Normandy bite at her aged skin. She saw the exhaustion in the eyes of the stonemasons and the growing resentment in the peasantry. The empire was being stretched to its breaking point. While Richard reveled in his defiance, Eleanor sensed the structural cracks not in the stone, but in the loyalty of the lords. The glorious reign of the lionheart was becoming a relentless machine of taxation and siege. In the early spring of 1199, a rumor of buried treasure led Richard to the gates of Chalus-Chabrol, a minor castle in the Limousin. Eleanor found it beneath the dignity of a king of England to risk everything for a cache of gold. Yet Richard's hunger for funds was insatiable. The siege was a trivial affair, a footnote in a life of epic crusades. Eleanor waited in the distance, her heart heavy with an inexplicable dread. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the irony of a lion-hunting field mice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a lone defender appeared on the castle walls, wielding a frying pan as a shield and a crossbow in his hands. Richard, walking the lines without his chainmail, laughed at the absurdity of the sight. He did not see the bolt leave the string. It struck with a dull thud, burying itself deep into his shoulder. No blood is shown, only the sudden, jarring halt of the king's laughter. In that moment, the fate of the Angevin Empire was sealed by a nameless archer and a moment of reckless arrogance. The wound was not immediately fatal, but the surgeon's clumsy attempt to remove the bolt left a jagged, festering mess. As the rot of gangrene set in, a messenger was dispatched to Eleanor. She rode with a speed that defied her 80 years, crossing miles of French countryside under a shroud of gray clouds. The world seemed to hold its breath as she approached the royal tent. The Queen Mother, who had outlived so many of her children, was now called to witness the final hours of her favorite, most troublesome son. Inside the dimly lit tent, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and impending death. Richard lay pale, his legendary strength drained by the infection. Eleanor took his hand, her face a mask of stoic grief. In a final act of chivalry, Richard summoned the archer who had shot him, pardoning the man before the silent court. As the lionheart took his final breath, the light seemed to fade from Eleanor's world. The son who had been her greatest pride and her greatest burden was gone, leaving the crown in the hands of the untried John. The silence that followed Richard's death was more terrifying than the din of war. Eleanor sat alone in the chapel, the flickering candlelight casting long, distorted shadows across the stone floor. She looked at the vacant seat of power and saw the impending collapse. The lands were vast, the enemies numerous, and the successor was a man she knew too well. John was clever, but lacked the gravitas of his brother and the wisdom of his father. The empire was a glass vase, and it had just been dropped from a great height. John's coronation was a somber, muted affair, stripped of the genuine adulation that had greeted Richard. The crown seemed too large for his head, the robes too heavy for his frame. Eleanor stood by his side, her presence a necessary anchor for a court drowning in uncertainty. The atmosphere was one of a funeral rather than a beginning. The lords knelt and swore their oaths, but their eyes were cold, searching for the weakness they knew lay beneath the royal mantle. The age of the Lionheart had ended. The age of the Lackland had begun. From the shadows of Brittany, a new threat emerged. Young Arthur, the son of Eleanor's late son, Geoffrey. The boy had a claim that many lords preferred over John's, and Philip of France was more than happy to fuel the fires of civil war. Eleanor found herself in a cruel position, forced to defend her youngest son against her own grandson. The family was cannibalizing itself once again, the legacy of Henry II dissolving into a series of bitter, localized betrayals. The Queen Mother prepared for one final campaign to save what remained. At 80 years of age, Eleanor undertook a grueling journey across the Pyrenees to the court of Castile. Her mission was to choose a granddaughter to marry the French prince, a strategic move to secure a fragile peace through the Treaty of Le Goulet. As she traveled through the rugged mountain passes, the parchment-like skin of her face reflected the harsh terrain. She was the ghost of a glorious past, still stitching the frayed seams of her family's destiny. Her body was failing, but her will remained the only thing holding the empire together. Eleanor arrived at the court of Castile in a state of exhaustion, yet her eyes remained sharp, searching for a spark of her own fire among her granddaughters. She bypassed the eldest, Urraca, sensing a lack of the necessary steel required to survive the treacherous French court. Instead, she chose the younger Blanche, a girl whose steady gaze and quiet resolve reminded the Dowager Queen of her own youth. In this child, Eleanor saw the final hope for a lasting peace. She spent her days in the Spanish heat, molding Blanche, whispering the secrets of queenship into her ear like a sacred transmission of power. The journey back toward the Pyrenees was a test of sheer endurance that would have broken a woman half Eleanor's age. The Treaty of Le Goulet hung in the balance, a fragile agreement that depended entirely on this marriage between Blanche and the French Prince Louis. As the caravan wound through the treacherous mountain passes, Eleanor watched the peaks with the gaze of a veteran general. She was no longer just a grandmother. She was the architect of Europe's borders, desperate to finish her blueprint before the ink of her life ran dry. Every jolt of the carriage was a reminder of her fading mortality. Upon reaching the borders of Aquitaine, the strain finally overcame the octogenarian queen. She realized she could not complete the final leg of the journey to the French court. In a bittersweet farewell, she handed Blanche over to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, entrusting her legacy to the girl's young shoulders. Eleanor's eyes, once bright with the fire of rebellion, were now clouded with the heavy fog of weariness. She turned her carriage toward the Abbey of Fontevraud, the place that had become her sanctuary and would soon become her final resting place, leaving the fate of the empire in the hands of the young. As Eleanor retreated into the silent, stone-walled world of Fontevraud, the empire she had painstakingly built began to crack under the erratic rule of her son, John. News reached the abbey of John's disastrous decisions, his impulsive marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, which had ignited the fury of the French king Philip Augustus. Sitting in her cell, surrounded by the flickering light of tallow candles, Eleanor felt the vibration of a collapsing dynasty. The peace she had sought through Blanche was already being undermined by John's incompetence. The shadows of the abbey walls seemed to close in, echoing the encroaching darkness over her lands. In 1202, the final betrayal came not from a foreign enemy, but from her own grandson, Arthur of Brittany, who laid siege to the castle of Mirbeau, where Eleanor was staying. The irony was bitter. Her own flesh and blood sought to capture her as a political pawn. John, in a rare moment of military brilliance, rushed to her rescue and captured Arthur. But the victory was hollow. The cruelty with which John treated his captives and the rumors of Arthur's subsequent disappearance turned the nobility of Poitou and Normandy against the Plantagenets forever. The foundation of the Angevin Empire was now turning to dust. By 1204, the unthinkable happened. Château Gaillard, the supposedly impregnable fortress built by Richard the Lionheart to guard Normandy, fell to the French. To Eleanor, this was more than a military defeat. It was the symbolic end of the world she had known. The Duchy of Normandy, the very heart of the family's power since the time of William the Conqueror, was being swallowed by the French crown. From her bed at Fontevraud, Eleanor listened to the reports of fleeing knights and lost territories. Her son's inheritance was vanishing, and she was too weak to take up the sword herself. Death was no longer a stranger to Eleanor. It was a constant companion that had taken 10 of her children and 2 of her husbands. As the spring of 1204 arrived, the Queen of England and Duchess of Aquitaine felt her own life force ebbing away. She had outlived her era, becoming a relic of a time when kings were legends and queens were titans. Her mind wandered through the halls of Poitiers, the courts of the Crusades, and the long, lonely years of her imprisonment. She was a woman who had seen the heights of glory and the depths of family betrayal, now preparing for the final silence. The air in the Abbey of Fontevraud was thick with the scent of incense and damp stone as the nuns gathered to pray for the passing of their greatest patron. Eleanor lay still, her breathing a rhythmic whisper that seemed to synchronize with the tolling of the abbey bells. Even in her final moments, she wore the invisible crown of her authority. She had survived the scandals of Paris, the wars of her sons, and the fury of Henry II. Now, as the shadows lengthened across the abbey floor, she prepared to meet the God she had both served and defied throughout her turbulent, extraordinary life. On April 1st, 1204, the woman who had dominated European politics for 6 decades finally closed her eyes. With her death, the last great pillar of the Angevin Empire crumbled. She died knowing that Normandy was lost and that John was a king without a kingdom's respect. Yet there was a profound peace in her departure. She had played the Game of Thrones longer and harder than any man of her age. As the news of her passing spread across the Channel, even her enemies paused to acknowledge the end of an epoch. The Lioness of Aquitaine was silent at last, leaving behind a legacy of fire. They buried her in the heart of Fontevraud, placed in a grand tomb beside Henry II and her beloved son Richard. Her effigy shows her not as a mourning widow, but as a queen, eternally reading a book, her face serene and ageless. Though the empire she loved would continue to fragment under John's reign, her bloodline would endure through the kings and queens of Europe for centuries. She remained in death what she was in life, a woman who refused to be forgotten, etched into the very stone of history, watching over the ruins of the dynasty she had fought so hard to preserve. With Eleanor of Aquitaine now silent in the earth of Fontevraud, the weight of the Angevin Empire fell entirely upon the shoulders of King John. Known as Lackland for his lack of inheritance in his youth, he now found himself the sole guardian of a crumbling legacy. Without his mother's diplomatic genius or his brother's martial prestige, John stood alone against a rising tide of dissent. In the drafty halls of his castles, the shadows seemed to lengthen, whispering of the immense shoes he was destined to fill. Shoes that seemed to grow heavier with every passing day of his precarious reign. The collapse began in the heart of the family's ancestral lands. King Philip II of France, a tireless rival to the Plantagenets, seized the opportunity presented by Eleanor's death. One by one, the territories she had guarded for decades, Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, slipped through John's fingers. The fall of Château Gaillard, Richard's saucy castle, signaled the end of an era. The map of Europe was being redrawn in blood and ink, and the great continental empire Eleanor had painstakingly built was dissolving into the dust of history, leaving the English crown isolated and vulnerable across the Channel. For every coin, ignoring the ancient for every coin, ignoring the ancient customs of the realm, the once loyal lords of England began to gather in secret, their faces obscured by the gloom of candlelit chambers. They spoke of rights, of ancient liberties, and of a king who had become a tyrant. The ghost of Eleanor's iron-willed governance lived on in their memories, but they saw in her son only the wreckage of a dynasty that had lost its way. By the year 1215, the tension culminated in a soggy meadow at Runnymede. Forced by his rebellious barons, John was compelled to set his seal to the Magna Carta. This great charter sought to limit the power of the king, ensuring that even the sovereign was subject to the law. It was a humiliating blow to a man who believed in the absolute divine right of his bloodline. Though he had no intention of honoring the document, the ink on the parchment represented a seismic shift in the history of power, a legacy of Eleanor's lineage that would eventually reshape the world. Legend tells of the loss of the crown. Legend tells of the loss of the crown jewels and the remnants of the royal treasury. The physical symbols of his family's grandeur vanishing into the mud. Sick and broken, John retreated to Newark Castle, where he succumbed to dysentery. He died as he lived, a king in retreat, leaving behind a fractured kingdom and a 9-year-old son to inherit the ruins of the Plantagenet dream. While John's reign sputtered out in England, the legacy of Eleanor of Aquitaine flourished elsewhere through her daughters. Her namesake, Eleanor of England, had become the Queen of Castile, mothering a generation of kings and saints. Through her, Eleanor's fierce spirit and political acumen moved into the Iberian Peninsula. These women, often overlooked by the chronicles of war, were the quiet architects of European diplomacy. They carried their mother's blood, and her lessons in power into the most influential courts of the continent, ensuring the Plantagenet influence would never truly be extinguished by a single failing king. Among Eleanor's most formidable granddaughters was Blanche of Castile, who would become Queen of France. Handpicked by Eleanor herself in her final years, Blanche possessed the same indomitable will that had defined her grandmother. She ruled France as regent with a steady hand, defending her son Louis IX's throne against rebellious nobles and foreign threats. In a strange twist of fate, the very crown that had once been Eleanor's greatest rival was now held by her own flesh and blood, a testament to the old queen's foresight in weaving her family into the tapestry of European royalty. The concept of Eleanor as the grandmother of Europe was no mere title. It was a geopolitical reality. By the mid-13th century, her descendants sat upon the thrones of England, France, Castile, and Sicily. The Devil's Brood, as the Plantagenets were often called, had matured into a sprawling network of monarchs. Even as the specific lands Eleanor once held were lost or contested, her genetic and political imprint remained indelible. The sheer scale of her legacy meant that every major conflict and alliance for centuries would involve someone carrying the fire of her restless, ambitious spirit. In England, the crown passed to John's young son, Henry III. His reign was a long, arduous attempt to stabilize the kingdom his father had nearly destroyed. Under the guidance of great knights like William Marshall, the boy king began to rebuild the prestige of the monarchy. Though the empire in France was gone, a new English identity began to forge itself from the ashes. Henry would dedicate himself to the memory of Edward the Confessor, but the administrative and legal foundations laid during the time of his grandparents remained the bedrock upon which his New England would be built. The castles Eleanor had once walked, Chinon, Poitiers, and Windsor, stood as silent witnesses to the shifting tides of power. The stone walls, thick with moss and history, held the echoes of her laughter and her commands. While the borders of the Plantagenet Empire continued to contract, the cultural and legal shifts she ignited lived on. Her patronage of courtly love, her influence on the rights of women, and her sheer defiance of the limitations placed upon her sex created a blueprint for future queens. She had watched her family collapse, yet she had ensured their survival in the very DNA of Europe. As the 13th century dawned, Eleanor of Aquitaine found herself an octogenarian in a world that rarely saw such longevity. The once vibrant queen now moved with a deliberate, slow grace. Her hands, veined like the very parchment she signed, still clutching the reins of an empire that was fraying at the edges. Her youngest son, John, now sat upon the throne, but his grip was slippery. Eleanor watched from the shadows of her various estates, her mind a library of political maneuvers and bitter losses. She remained the ultimate diplomat, the only person capable of bridging the widening chasm between the Plantagenet crown and the disgruntled French king, Philip Augustus. King John's reign was a storm of his own making. Unlike his brother Richard, who had commanded respect through martial prowess, John's power was built on a foundation of suspicion and broken promises. Eleanor saw the cracks forming in the loyalty of the barons, who whispered of rebellion in the dark corners of London's taverns. She mentored John with a fierce, almost desperate intensity, trying to instill in him the political cunning he so lacked. Yet, as the French king encroached upon their ancestral lands in Normandy, Eleanor realized that the legacy she and Henry II had built was being dismantled piece by her own flesh and blood. In a final act of grandmotherly duty and political survival, Eleanor undertook a perilous journey across the Pyrenees. At 80 years old, she traveled to the court of Castile to select a bride for the French heir, Louis. This was not merely a wedding arrangement. It was a desperate peace treaty. She chose her granddaughter, Blanche, a girl who possessed the same steel and fire that Eleanor had once wielded. As the carriage rattled through the mountain passes, Eleanor reflected on how her life had been a series of strategic moves on a continental chessboard. Her very family, the pieces she sacrificed for the game. The year 1204 brought the news Eleanor had long feared, the fall of Normandy. The great fortress of Chateau Gaillard, Richard's saucy castle, had finally succumbed to the French siege. With its fall, the heart of the Angevin Empire was cut out. Eleanor, now residing at the Abbey of Fontevraud, watched as the lands she had brought to the English crown through 2 marriages and decades of strife were swallowed by the French tide. The collapse was not just a loss of territory. It was the symbolic death of the world she had helped create. The map of her life was being redrawn in her absence. Exhausted by the endless cycle of war and the betrayals of her children, Eleanor retreated fully into the spiritual sanctuary of Fontevraud Abbey. She swapped her royal silks for the simple, heavy habit of a nun, yet her presence remained regal. Even in the silence of the cloister, she was not forgotten. Messengers still arrived at the abbey gates, seeking the counsel of the woman who had known 2 kings as husbands and 3 as sons. She spent her days in prayer and reflection, the stone walls of the abbey echoing with the ghosts of the family she had watched tear itself apart. Within the quietude of the abbey, Eleanor looked upon the faded tapestries of her youth. She remembered the courts of love in Poitiers, where troubadours sang of chivalry and devotion. It felt like a lifetime lived by a different woman. The reality of her reign had been far grittier. Battles in the Holy Land, years of imprisonment by her own husband, and the agonizing sight of her sons turning their swords against one another. The romantic ideals she had championed had been crushed under the weight of political necessity and the brutal mechanics of power. She was the architect of a culture that she herself had outlived. Eleanor's nights were filled with the shadows of the men she had loved and fought. Henry II, with his relentless energy and volatile temper, seemed to haunt the corridors of her mind. She saw her sons, young Henry, the crownless king, Geoffrey, the schemer, and Richard, the lion-hearted crusader. All were dead, leaving only John to carry the heavy burden of her lineage. She realized that her greatest tragedy was not the loss of her empire, but the survival of her own spirit while so many of her children had predeceased her. She was a mother who had outlasted her own legacy. In the spring of 1204, Eleanor's health finally began to fail. The fire that had sustained her through 82 years of rebellion, travel, and governance was dimming. The nuns of Fontevraud gathered around her, their soft chants a backdrop to her final reflections. She was not a woman who feared death. She had stared it down on the battlefield and in the birthing chamber many times before. As her breathing slowed, she felt the weight of the crown finally lifting from her brow. She had been a queen to the very last breath, a woman who had defined an age by her sheer refusal to be quieted. Eleanor of Aquitaine died on April 1st, 1204. She was laid to rest in the church at Fontevraud, placed beside her husband Henry II and her son Richard the Lionheart. Her tomb effigy was unique for the time. It depicted her not in a state of passive rest, but holding a book, a symbol of her intellect and her patronage of learning. Even in death, she defied the expectations of her gender. She left behind a fractured empire and a family in decline, yet her bloodline would flow through every royal house in Europe for centuries to come. The queen was gone, but her shadow remained. The collapse of the Plantagenet Empire continued after her passing, but the seeds Eleanor had planted bore fruit in unexpected ways. Her granddaughters became queens of France and Castile, carrying her lessons of power and resilience into new territories. The legal reforms she supported and the cultural shifts she ignited became the bedrock of the High Middle Ages. Eleanor had watched her family collapse, but through her indomitable will, she had ensured that the name of Aquitaine and the spirit of the Plantagenets would never truly vanish from the pages of history. Her story was the blueprint for every queen who followed. With Eleanor finally laid to rest, the weight of the crown fell heavily upon her youngest son, John. Where his mother had been a weaver of alliances, John was a man of suspicion and sudden rages. The careful architecture of the Plantagenet Empire, once held together by Eleanor's iron will and Richard's martial glory, began to show deep fissures. The barons, long kept in check by the formidable queen, now looked upon their new king with eyes of cold calculation. The dark halls of Westminster, once vibrant with Eleanor's courtly culture, grew cold and silent as John retreated into a world of paranoia and failed diplomacy. The shadows of betrayal that had haunted Eleanor's life now lengthened over John's reign. Philip II of France, a man who had been outmaneuvered by Eleanor for decades, saw his chance to strike at the heart of the Angevin Empire. In 1204, the unthinkable happened. Normandy, the cradle of the dynasty, was lost. Without his mother's diplomatic shield, John watched helplessly as his continental holdings vanished. The loss was a permanent scar, a psychological blow that signaled the end of the cross-channel empire. The Plantagenets were being driven back to the shores of England, their grand European dreams dissolving into the mists of history. By 1215, the internal collapse Eleanor had feared reached its zenith at Runnymede. Forced by a coalition of rebellious barons, John was compelled to sign the Magna Carta. This document, born from royal failure and civil unrest, echoed the legal reforms Eleanor had once championed in her own lands. It was a pivotal moment in the British story, where the absolute power of the monarch was finally tethered to the rule of law. Though John viewed it as a humiliation, the spirit of Eleanor's intellectual curiosity and sense of justice lived within the ink of those historic clauses, shaping the future of a kingdom. While John's power waned in England, Eleanor's legacy thrived in the courts of her granddaughters. Blanche of Castile, now Queen of France, emerged as the true spiritual heir to Eleanor's authority. Governing with a combination of steel and sophistication, Blanche navigated the treacherous politics of the French court with the same skill her grandmother had used to defy kings. She defended the throne of her son, Louis IX, against all challengers, ensuring that the bloodline of Aquitaine remained at the center of European power. Eleanor's lessons in resilience had traveled across borders, proving that her influence would outlast her empire's physical borders. The cultural revolution Eleanor had ignited in Poitiers did not die with her. The ideals of courtly love and the lyrical traditions of the troubadours continued to spread like wildfire across the continent. Her granddaughters carried these sophisticated social codes to Spain, Sicily, and the Holy Roman Empire, transforming the warrior-centric culture of the Middle Ages into something more refined. The lady was no longer just a pawn in a marriage contract. She was now a patron of the arts and a figure of romantic inspiration. Eleanor had fundamentally altered the social fabric of the West, leaving behind a world that valued wit and poetry as much as steel. At Fontevraud Abbey, the stone effigies of the Plantagenets lay in eternal repose, a silent testament to the family's tumultuous existence. Eleanor's tomb was unique. She was depicted holding a book, a rare symbol of female literacy and intellectual power for the era. Even in stone, she seemed to be watching over her husband Henry and her son Richard, the three of them united in death despite the wars they had waged in life. The abbey became a quiet sanctuary, where the ghosts of the Angevin Empire lingered, and the memory of the queen who had challenged the world was preserved in the cold, unyielding limestone. As the 13th century marched on, the geography of power continued to shift. The vast lands of Aquitaine, which Eleanor had protected with such ferocity, were slowly being absorbed by the French crown. Only Gascony remained as a fading memory of her former glory. The English kings became more localized, their focus turning inward toward the island they ruled. The dream of a vast, multinational empire was fading into the annals of the past. Yet, the internal machinery of the English state, the legal systems and administrative structures Eleanor helped nurture, remained robust, providing the skeletal structure for the nation that England was destined to become. In the centuries after her death, a black legend began to form around Eleanor's memory. Monastic chroniclers, suspicious of her power and independence, sought to rewrite her history. They painted her as a figure of scandal, a manipulative queen who had poisoned her husband's peace and led her sons to ruin. This dark caricature was designed to serve as a warning to future generations about the dangers of women in power. However, beneath the layers of medieval propaganda, the true Eleanor remained, a strategist of unparalleled skill who had survived 3 crusades, 2 kings, and the collapse of her own family, while never yielding her dignity. Despite the attempts to tarnish her name, Eleanor of Aquitaine became the hidden blueprint for every powerful queen who followed. From Isabella of Castile to Elizabeth I, her story was studied by those who wished to understand how to hold power in a man's world. She had shown that a queen could be a regent, a soldier, and a diplomat all at once. Her life was a testament to the fact that power was not merely inherited, but must be defended through intellect and endurance. The path she had cut through the thicket of medieval patriarchy remained open for those brave enough to follow her shadow. Ultimately, Eleanor of Aquitaine's greatest triumph was her survival in the collective memory of history. She had watched her family collapse, her children die, and her empire shrink, yet she never allowed herself to be a victim of circumstances. She remained the architect of her own destiny until her final breath. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, her influence was found in the very fabric of European identity, in its laws, its art, and its concept of sovereignty. Eleanor had seen the world change, and through her indomitable spirit, she had ensured that she would always be remembered as its most formidable queen. By April 1204, the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine finally found peace within the silent walls of Fontevraud Abbey. She had outlived all but 2 of her 10 children, a staggering testament to her endurance and the heavy price of her longevity. As her pulse slowed, the vast Angevin empire she helped build stood on the precipice of ruin. Her final request was to be laid to rest beside her husband, Henry II, and her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. Even in death, she positioned herself as the centerpiece of a dynasty that had redefined the power structures of Western Europe. With Eleanor's guiding hand removed, the fragile stability of the Angevin realm shattered almost instantly. Her youngest son, King John, lacked the diplomatic finesse and military prestige of his mother and brother. Within months of her passing, the French King Philip Augustus seized Normandy, the ancestral heart of the Plantagenet lands. The collapse Eleanor had spent her final years trying to prevent was now a brutal reality. The shadows of history lengthened as the great continental empire dissolved, leaving John isolated on the island of Britain, a king without the continental reach that had once defined his mother's glory. Though her political empire crumbled, Eleanor's cultural legacy proved indestructible. She had been the greatest patron of the troubadours, fostering an era of courtly love that transformed the social fabric of the Middle Ages. Her courts in Poitiers had become legendary centers of art, music, and literature, where the concepts of chivalry and romantic devotion were codified. This soft power radiated outward from her life, influencing generations of poets and thinkers. Long after her castles fell to rivals, the songs written in her honor continued to echo through the halls of Europe, immortalizing her spirit in verse. Eleanor's influence was not merely cultural, it was biological. Known as the Grandmother of Europe, her bloodline flowed through the royal houses of Castile, Sicily, and France. Through strategic marriages, she had ensured that her descendants would sit on every significant throne in Christendom. Even as the Angevin Empire faded, her DNA remained the scaffolding upon which European monarchy was built. These queens and kings carried her fierce intelligence and political acumen into the Renaissance, making her the matriarch of a continental network of power that would dictate the course of history for centuries to come. Historical records from the 13th century portray a woman who was both feared and revered. To the chroniclers of her time, Eleanor was a singular woman, beautiful yet dangerous, pious yet rebellious. These early accounts laid the groundwork for the black legend that would often obscure the real Eleanor under layers of myth and scandal. Modern historians, however, look past the medieval bias to see a brilliant administrator and a survivor. The mystery of her true character remains locked within the dark corners of history, a puzzle of a queen who refused to be confined by the expectations of her gender. Eleanor's defiance of the status quo remains one of her most significant contributions to the concept of sovereignty. By asserting her rights as the Duchess of Aquitaine, she challenged the patriarchal structures of both the French and English crowns. She proved that a woman could hold land, lead armies, and govern territories independently, even in an age that sought to silence female voices. Her long imprisonment by Henry II only served to highlight her importance. He feared her influence because he knew she was his equal in every sense. Her legacy became a blueprint for future queens regnant. The Devil's Brood, as her children were called, left a trail of blood and borders across the map of Europe. The constant civil wars between Henry's sons, fueled by their mother's support and their father's control, fundamentally shifted the geopolitical landscape. These conflicts forged the national identities of England and France, pushing them toward centralized statehood. Eleanor watched this chaotic evolution with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Her family's internal collapse was the catalyst for the birth of modern nations, as the personal disputes of the Plantagenets transformed into the institutionalized wars of the coming centuries. Beyond politics, Eleanor's era saw the transition from the heavy Romanesque style to the soaring aspirations of Gothic architecture. She was a witness to the construction of the great cathedrals, projects that mirrored her own desire for transcendence and permanence. The shift in aesthetics, from dark, thick-walled fortresses to light-filled, stained-glass monuments, coincided with her life. Her patronage supported these monumental shifts, ensuring that the visual landscape of her empire reflected the same complexity and grandeur that she embodied. Her world was literally being rebuilt in stone and glass as she navigated its shifting tides. In the centuries following her death, Eleanor of Aquitaine transitioned from a historical figure to a literary icon. From Shakespeare's King John to modern cinematic portrayals, she has been reinvented as the ultimate matriarch and schemer. Each era projects its own values onto her, viewing her through the lens of contemporary gender politics. Yet, the real Eleanor remains elusive, a woman of deep shadows and brilliant light. Her story continues to fascinate because she represents the eternal struggle for agency in a world designed to deny it. She remains the queen who watched it all fall, yet never fell herself, As the sun sets on the story of the Angevin Empire, Eleanor of Aquitaine stands as its most enduring figure. She was the bridge between the old world of feudal lords and the new world of sovereign states. Though she watched her family collapse and her empire shrink, she never lost the essence of her power. She died as she lived, a duchess in her own right, a queen of two nations, and the mother of legends. Her life was a testament to the fact that while empires are fleeting, the impact of a singular iron-willed spirit can endure for 1,000 years. In the wake of Eleanor's passing, the silence within the halls of the Angevin court became a heavy, physical presence. The vibrant tapestries of her life, woven with the threads of ambition and survival, began to fray at the edges. Her youngest son, John, sat upon a throne that felt increasingly precarious without his mother's diplomatic guidance. The great halls, once filled with the whispers of her council and the music of her troubadours, were now cold. The empire she had painstakingly stitched together through blood and marriage was beginning to unravel, leaving only the memory of her formidable presence behind. King John, often called Soft Sword, struggled to maintain the vast continental holdings Eleanor had cherished. By 1204, the unthinkable happened. Normandy, the ancestral heart of the dynasty, fell to the French king Philip Augustus. This loss was not merely territorial, it was a symbolic shattering of the Angevin dream. Eleanor's spirit seemed to haunt the battlements as her lands were stripped away. The collapse she had feared during her long life was now a grim reality, as the pride of the Plantagenets was humbled by a more patient and calculating French crown. The loss of the French lands forced the monarchy to turn its gaze inward, toward the rebellious barons of England. The tension that had brewed since the days of Henry II finally reached a breaking point. Though Eleanor was gone, her legacy of legal reform and administrative power lingered in the background of the conflict. The resulting document, the Magna Carta, was born from the wreckage of the family's absolute rule. It was a pivot point in history where the iron will of the sovereign was finally checked by the law, marking the end of the era Eleanor had personified. In the quiet sanctuary of Fontevraud Abbey, the physical remains of the Angevin dynasty rested in stone. The effigies of Henry II, Eleanor, and Richard the Lionheart lay side by side, frozen in perpetual peace. In life, they had been a storm of conflicting ambitions, betrayals, and fierce love. In death, they became monuments to a vanished world. The abbey's vaulted ceilings echoed with the prayers of the nuns, serving as a solemn archive for the family that had once ruled from the Pyrenees to the Scottish borders. Their stony silence was the final chapter of a tumultuous saga. Eleanor's influence extended far beyond the borders of her lands, living on through the cultural shift she had championed. The concept of courtly love and the romanticized ideals of chivalry, which she had fostered in her court at Poitiers, reshaped the European mind. Her patronage of poets and troubadours ensured that her story would be told in song for centuries. She was the muse for a new kind of literature that elevated the status of women and refined the brutal edges of the knightly class. Even as her political empire collapsed, her cultural conquest was just beginning to take root. The grandmother of Europe left a genetic map that traced its way through every significant royal house of the Middle Ages. Her daughters and granddaughters sat on the thrones of Castile, Sicily, and France, carrying her iron-willed spirit into new territories. Through these women, Eleanor's bloodline survived the collapse of the Angevin Empire, ensuring her influence persisted through the centuries. Her legacy was no longer a single kingdom, but a vast, interconnected web of dynasties. She had transformed from a queen of two nations into the matriarch of a continent's future, a silent architect of European history. Medieval chroniclers, often biased and critical of her power, struggled to capture the true essence of Eleanor. They painted her as a temptress, a rebel, and a grieving mother. Yet their ink could not contain her complexity. In the dusty archives of monasteries, her name appeared in charters and letters, a testament to her tireless administrative work. These records reveal a woman who was a masterful politician even in her 80th year. To understand the collapse of her family, historians had to sift through the layers of myth to find the iron-willed woman who refused to be a footnote. The castles Eleanor once inhabited, from the sunny palaces of Aquitaine to the damp fortresses of England, became silent witnesses to the passage of time. These stones held the echoes of her laughter, her arguments with Henry, and her quiet prayers for her children. Though the banners changed and the walls crumbled, the Eleanor spirit remained embedded in the landscape. Her presence was felt in the architecture of the cathedrals she funded and the laws she helped shape. She had become a part of the very earth she had once ruled, a ghost in the machinery of the Western world. Looking back at the map of her life, the collapse of the Angevin Empire seems inevitable, yet Eleanor's survival remains a miracle of the age. She outlived her husband and all but 2 of her 10 children, standing tall while the world she knew crumbled into the dust of history. Her life was a bridge between the old feudal world and the birth of sovereign nations. She saw the rise and fall of kings, the birth of empires, and the slow turn of the wheel of fortune. Her story is one of enduring resilience in the face of absolute domestic and political ruin. Eleanor of Aquitaine was more than a queen. She was a force of nature that redefined the possibilities of power. Though she watched her family collapse and her empire shrink, she never lost the essence of her own authority. She died as she lived, a duchess in her own right, a queen of 2 nations, and the mother of legends. Her life remains a testament to the fact that while empires are fleeting, the impact of a singular, iron-willed spirit can endure for 1,000 years. She remains the greatest queen of the Middle Ages, a shadow that still looms over history.